Hi, it's Victor Perton here, and this is a wonderful joint podcast video cast from Encompassed Purpose and the Centre for Optimism. And no greater pleasure have I got than introducing my co-host and the person who's interviewing me, Brad.
How's it going today?
Oh, fantastic, Brad. It's spring, late spring here. It's a slightly cooler day, but we've been in lockdown for weeks and weeks, and finally we don't have to wear masks outside. We still have to wear them inside, and restaurants are opening up, and we're starting to invite each other to coffee and dinner again, but it's been a long and grueling COVID lockdown.
It has been a different year, that's for sure.
Well, we've had success. Australia, is at such a low level of COVID infection and COVID death. It really has been a community pulling together, accepting restrictions that we don't particularly like, but still coming through. Perhaps for a lot of people, the old Nietzschean proverb, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Has certainly been true for a large part of the population. And one of the interesting challenges is going to be for businesses that operate in offices. Do people want to come back? I had this, as you know, we're doing this Better Normal project globally, and I had a quote from a lady the other day. It was, I just love being at home, being near my partner, being able to go out into the garden. If I need to do service calls, I can do it during the working day. And best of all, I can set my own temperature in the workplace. Now, what office can compete with that, Brad? The eternal battle in offices between men like you and me in jackets and ladies in dresses, it is always room for conflict on what the office temperature should be.
Well, not to mention when you're at home, you probably like your coworkers, all of them. So,
and the pets. In Australia, of course, the pets have never been happier. Dogs have never been walked more. Cats have never been stroked more.
See, there's good that comes out of everything, even pandemics.
Exactly. So, what about you? What's life like? Because come from the other side of the world where, COVID is, relatively controlled. We get the impression that it's out of control in the US. What's it like for you? What's daily life like in the COVID environment?
Well, and I would say it was out of control, then it started to be in control, and then we had the second part of it is very, I would say, a little bit nerve-wracking because it's very out of control right now. And it depends on what part of the country. Some parts of the country, masks are fine. Being inside is fine. Other parts, like from Missouri, where I'm from, nobody pretty much wears masks, and they kind of go where they want to. So I don't know what's going to happen as far as when it's going to get better, and what it's going to take to get better. Hopefully,
I was listening today. The chief scientist for the World Health Organization is a very talented Indian lady. Said she's very optimistic now for the vaccines. That Australia's got, I think we've got on order enough vaccines to cover the population 3 times over. We've picked every possible winner. So I suspect the injections will start next month. And I think, once you've got 40, 50, 60, and then towards 80% of the population covered. But for instance, there's challenges. Qantas, which is the main Australian airline, I think is going to have a COVID vaccine passport. You don't get on the plane for an international flight unless you're vaccinated. But look, that's enough COVID for us. We're talking about purpose, faith, and optimism.
Right.
And so my first question to you, Brad, is what makes you optimistic?
Well, it's going a little bit back to what we were just talking about with the COVID. I think, it's a pandemic. Nobody wants a pandemic. But out of this, I believe is going to come quite a few things. It's going to be a collaboration and a lot of learning about each other and maybe losing some bad habits we had from the 80s that started in the 80s, and realizing family's important and friends are important and employees are important. They're not just a number. And I think, I guess, getting back to humanizing business, human-centric business, I think that's what I'm so optimistic about. We got this idea in the 80s that numbers were the bottom line to everything, and it's not. And now I think it's coming full circle back around, where we appreciate the employees, the people, and I think that's going to make a huge difference. And in some of my research with the younger people, I've seen that too, where family's very important to them. And younger, I'm talking 30s and 20s, but it's very important to them, and getting back to that. And so I'm really excited about that, because I think we had quite a while there where we kind of lost focus of what's really important, and I think we'll be coming back to that.
That's fantastic. We did a webinar with Phoenix, Australia, which is Australia, originally started as the military post-traumatic injury and recovery centre. It now covers the whole of society and is now a global organisation. And one of the questioners asked, the director about the role of faith and optimism. And I know faith is very important to you and Encompassed purpose. And he said, look, there's just not enough focus on this. There's no doubt at all that faith, whether it's faith in God or, as you've talked about, faith in your fellow man or woman, is a fantastic underpinning for optimism. So, in your research and, your work coaching small business and the like, what is the role of faith in fostering and promoting optimism, both in the leader and in the worker?
Well, I think faith and the word, if you look at the Bible and how wise it is, every self-improvement book ever made took from the Bible. That one book has the best of every motivational speaker right in it. So I think, if you look at it, no matter what your beliefs are, you have the morals, you have the faith, you have the optimism, you have the drive, to keep going. It's all right there. And that's why I think it's so important and so much more beneficial being a Christian coach than a secular coach, because we can rely on that and see, the different aspects. You can grow within the faith and know there's a higher purpose for you, and it's not all on you.
And it's true not just of Christianity, of course, because, of course, Hinduism, and Diwali is about optimism. Judaism, the Old Testament for Christians. One of the leading rabbis shared with me the other day, to be a Jew, you have to be an optimist. So we see it across faiths, which is great. But I've recently been rereading Norman Vincent Peale. And of course, controversial in some senses, because Donald Trump claims to have been his best ever student. But if you go back to that 1952 classic, which was the top seller in New York for, I think, 2 years, The Power of Positive Thinking, whilst it's rooted in the Bible and faith, what's interesting is how modern the text is when you reread it, because there's meditation, there's periods of silence, there's self-reflection, there's the role of prayer, but not just, I love what he says when he says, don't just pray small, pray big when you're going to pray. Don't bother God with the little stuff. And yet, on the other hand, he then gives his anecdotes and stories about business people, who being faced with a decision, saying, what would God say, looking over my shoulder? And one of my tricks with time management, Brad, actually came from a lady who died this year, who was actually a Hindu leader, Dadi Janki. There's a woman-led sect called the Brahma Kumaris. You probably met them. They've got meditation centers around the world. But she met me in the 90s, and I was a politician in those days, and said, you must be very busy, Victor. And I said, yes, I am. And she said, well, look, you should meditate. And I said, look, I do. And But she said, look, here's some tricks for time management. And they're really fantastic, Brad. I love them still. She said, if someone asks you to do something and it's something that will bring you joy and fulfillment and you can do it, say yes. Then if someone asks you to do something that will further you or your cause and you can do it, do it. And if it's something you must do, of course, it answers itself. But everything else is a waste of time. So that sort of bringing you joy, advancing, or something you've got to do. Fantastic. But the fourth question she gave me, and she said, and if you were looking at your calendar or your diary in the morning and God was looking over your shoulder, what would he say about how you're spending your time? Is it useful or is it wasted? So, like you, my faith is rooted in Christianity, but what I love doing in my work at the Centre for Optimism is it's almost a universal rule of faith that optimism needs to be a part of it.
Oh, I totally agree. And then in the morning, that's the first thing I start my day with is gratitude. And I think that's another thing I think 2020 somewhat brought back, some of the things we didn't appreciate. Now you see the little things. Boy, I used to be able to go out and do this. You recognize when I could walk around without a mask on, But if you start out with gratitude and just think about all the things you're grateful for, it's a great way to start the day.
Well, in fact, in our when we do it in prisons, we do it in major corporates. When we talk to people, one of the habits of the optimist is gratitude. And Martin Seligman's formula, I think, is just spot on. Where at the end of the day or in the evening, you write down in a journal or a piece of paper the 3 best things in the day that you're grateful for, and you leave it by your bed. So that in the morning you don't wake up to the news. Nothing worse than waking up to the news. Whether you're going and sitting on the toilet or you're having a cup of coffee, you take that journal or piece of paper and reread what you wrote from yesterday. And the medical evidence appears to be that it's more effective than antidepressants or anti-anxiety drugs, because most of those don't work, but re-expressing. The other thing that I think is funny, Brad, is people keep, of course, talking about gratitude exercises and writing down your gratitude. But the one thing they forget is making that phone call or that SMS and say, oh, thanks for what you did yesterday, or thanks for that lunch, or God, that coffee with you was good, or God, that I just woke up this morning and remembered what you said. God, it was clever.
Yeah, and I actually try to do that. And to be honest, I think that is as good for me as it is for the person getting it. It again makes you realize how good that was for you, and then it shows a person how much you appreciated it also.
Yeah, exactly. And I often when I read, I tend to use optimism filters for reading newspapers these days. So I probably get sources from probably 100 newspapers, but they all have to have the word optimism or optimistic in it. And but if there's ever an email address for the author, I always make a point, if the article's good, of sending them a little note that just says thanks, great article. And most journalists tell you that they hardly ever get a response, even if they put their email at the bottom of the article. So that little bit of thanks, even to the most famous of people, lifts them and lifts you.
Yeah, and it's good both ways. Like you were saying, if you start out the right way with that piece of paper or something, instead of just jumping on Facebook and getting right into it, and you didn't have that gratitude and didn't have, moments to think, it really affects your whole day. If you just take that time to be thankful and, have gratitude, it can change your whole day. Just 10 minutes of thinking in the morning. So.
Well, the other hint we give, which has been very effective in prison and elsewhere, is actually changing your greeting. In Australia, if someone says, how are you? You say, g'day, how are you? Or hello, how are you? It's so automatic. You know, people will, in Australia, people say not bad or not too bad. It's actually a bit like the French. You know, you don't, you know, obviously the other third of people will say good, terrific, whatever. But so many times you get this not bad or not too bad, which is a wasted question and a wasted answer. So we actually say, look, when you greet someone, use something like, oh, what's been the best thing in your day? Or what's been good? Or what's going well? Whatever's natural to the language. And you bias it to the positive right from the beginning of the greeting. And I recently did an interview on New Zealand radio. And the commentator said, oh, ladies and gentlemen, I've been plagiarizing this man for a year. And that was, in fact, the trick he was using. Like you, he's a business coach. And his customers now know that when he's coming into the room, he wants to hear a story of hope and optimism from them, not a grumble, some story of success. And in that sense, it picks up the wisdom of big business. You know, Disney, for instance, under Bob Iger's leadership, you know, really worked out that what people are yearning for are stories of optimism and hope. And, you know, that's a lesson to every small and large businessman in every country in the world. What your customers want to hear from you is your stories of hope and optimism, you know, how you've helped a client or how a client has got their own story of hope and optimism. So what are you finding? I mean, you're coaching lots and lots of businesses, and you know, generally, you know, the American economy seems to be very upbeat. What are you finding in those stories of optimism and hope amongst the people you coach and the people around you?
Oh, I think it is doing well. You know, everybody had to adjust and pivot a little bit this year. Just to go back to what you were saying just a second ago, I once heard a speaker, he said, you can't always say business is doing well, but you never want to say it's doing bad. So you can always say, when somebody asks you, how's business? You can always say, unbelievable. But no, this year, I think, you know, it had challenges for business owners, and I think they pivoted and changed and adjusted. And again, not to kind of beat on this, but I think some of it's turning out to be better, because you can do things that we weren't doing. You know, we're so used to doing things for so many decades one way. This showed us new ways of doing things. We didn't really have a choice. We had to do it real quick and change things real quick and adjust. But by doing that, now we've opened up all new ways to do business. I know people now that some of their head people are states away, and it works just fine. They don't have to be sitting in the office. And I think it kind of showed us CEOs like me, you know, maybe we're not as important as we thought we were. You know, the ship can sail on different boats. You know what I mean? Where we don't have to all be on one boat. We can be on several boats rowing together, you know, and it works just fine. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things, though, I'm on the board of one of the largest water utilities in Australia. And what's been interesting is how the CEO and the senior people have been able to join in management meetings and conversations that they wouldn't have joined in the past. So just being able to beam in on, you know, Zoom or whatever other method you use for even the first 10 minutes of a meeting to share without the need to walk across the building or drive across town. I think that's been an incredible change that I've seen, where CEOs and senior management are able to engage with people they wouldn't regularly engage with. I think the other thing from an Australian perspective, you know, Melbourne-Sydney is one of the most trafficked air routes on earth. You know, 2 cities of 5 million, heavily integrated, and people would jump on a plane for a 1-hour meeting. And when I lived in the United States, I was astonished by the level of air travel. You know, again, oftentimes for one 1-hour meeting. And I think now people are going to be much braver and say, look, I can do this by video. Yesterday, we did a wonderful webinar for a regional innovation festival, and it was on presence robots. So that the CEO doesn't need to be present in the office. The robot can walk around with basically the iPad with the face of the CEO on it and chatting away and being present. I mean, the main purpose of it is for people who are sick or the like. So the kid who's got leukemia and can't be at school, it's basically almost an avatar of them in the classroom and with their groups of friends. So those are amazing things. But I think there'll be a lot more. No, I'm not going to hop on a plane and waste a whole day to go to Sydney or Melbourne for a 1 hour meeting, or in your case, Chicago to Seattle or Chicago to New York. I think we're going to be a lot more sensible. It's going to be a lot better for the environment and a lot better for family life. Mum or dad doesn't need to leave at 5 a.m. and come back exhausted at 10 p.m.
I totally agree. And funny enough, Friday this week, I have a new client coming in. And everybody went to Zoom and went to phone calls and went to text. And it's been so long that all of a sudden I realized he wanted to come in person. It's like, oh, nobody's done that for a while. So that'll be kind of fun to actually have somebody in person the first time in months. So
well, I'm still adjusting to that because, of course, here we've got almost zero COVID, but I'm still, people are saying, come and have lunch or come and have coffee. I'm still thinking, oh, do I really want to sit within a meter or 3 feet of someone else and breathe their air in? So having a bit like, sort of all of those dystopian movies where people live in fear. And then, when it in fact relaxes, people are still in fear. So even though I'm the huge optimist and I love people's company, I've got so used to doing this with people from around the world that the notion of actually sitting 3 feet away. But I mean, there's a lot of science around the benefit of being close, of whether you're men or women or both, the hormones and chemicals that come off you as you smile and greet and move your hands is actually a big part of any human bonding. Even the shaking of hands, this bloody elbow stuff, I hope that doesn't become entrenched. I hope we come back to, men and women being able to shake hands again.
Yeah, and that's something I've done for years. So it's trying to get out of that habit a little bit. Where I automatically just reach out my hand, and then you can't do that, especially right now in America.
Oh, I carry a bottle of fluid and say we can both do this afterwards.
Right. And I'm a church greeter at times too, and that's one thing you kind of have to watch people's body language, because some people are comfortable with it, and some people just don't want that right now, and it's very understandable. So.
Now, you had some questions you wanted to ask me.
How did you come up with the idea for the center?
Well, what happened was in my earlier life, I was a barrister and a trial attorney, and then I was a member of parliament, a legislator for 18 years, and always interesting and always avant-garde policy, early days of the internet, what we were doing in e-government. Bill Gates wrote about in Business at the Speed of Thought, saying we were best in the world. But 2006, I'd had enough of politics. I could see this trend towards 24/7 negativity. Whereas I was an old-fashioned legislator, I would, in the English parliaments and the Australian parliaments, you have a thing called question time. So there's an hour of every sitting day where the ministers, or in your case, secretaries, have to be in the parliament, and they can be asked any question, and there's lots of shouting and passion, and you do that, and then you can go out and do a press conference and say awful things about someone, and then go back in and have a cup of coffee with that same person, or a beer, and really talk about solving the world's problems. But the 24/7 political attack life is quite different. So I found that unpleasant. So I left politics, and then as luck would have it, I spent 3 years as Trade and Investment Commissioner in the Americas across North and South America. And the stereotype of Australians in the US is so positive that my work was made easy. The chairman of Caterpillar said, "You Aussies remind me of the Americans of 100 years ago. Nothing is impossible." The Secretary General of the Rio Olympics said to me, "All I want is an Olympic Games like Sydney, a legacy like the Melbourne Olympics 1956. You know, because Melbourne is still a global centre of sport, and you know the tennis will go on, etc." And just amazing things happened to me. It made my work very easy. And then after that, I worked on the G20. You know, of course, recently it's been in the news again. And at that super elite level of presidents, prime ministers, finance ministers, central bank governors, it was exactly the same trust in us as Australians. And you know, trust is an optimistic thing. Trust is being optimistic that the person who makes their promise will carry it out. So again, I had that. And then 2015, I moved back to Melbourne. And it was like the only people who didn't understand how good Australian leadership was Australians themselves. So, you know, negativity about politics, that's universal. You know, you have to be able to joke about your political leaders. But in Australia, the negativity around leadership was, in fact, much wider. And it puzzled me. So rather than complain about the complainers, I set up the Australian Leadership Project. And we interviewed 2,500 people on the qualities of Australian leadership. And Australian leadership differs from global leadership in three significant ways. And it differs from American leadership in two particular ways. So the first one is egalitarianism. So the science shows that Australian leadership is the most egalitarian on earth. You have to speak to the cleaner or the driver with exactly the same respect that you have for the chairman. And the Prime Minister sits in the front seat of the car, not the back seat of the car, right? There's very much, you know, and we had Prime Minister Turnbull who would catch the tram or the train or the ferry, you know, rather than being in an armoured convoy. And so that's number one. Number two is self-effacing humour, right? And of course, in a number of countries, people don't like self-effacing humour. They think you're a bit of a fag if you know, joke against yourself. But in Australia, you have to take your work seriously, but laugh at yourself. And a big part of our humour is self-effacing. You know, typically I'll talk about diet and the like and point to my tummy or the like. And the third feature, which is common to parts of American society as well, is no bullshit plain speaking. And so if those are the three qualities of Australian leadership, egalitarianism, self-effacing humour and no bullshit plain speaking, well, there's millions of people like that. You know, it's why a country with 25 million people is knocking on the door of the G8. You know, it's why we've survived the COVID pandemic without too many deaths. And so at the end of this 2.5-year study, I was still bewildered. You know, if the leadership is actually okay, what's wrong? And then I had the chance at the Global Integrity Summit of 2017 to be on the final panel. And my presentation was the case for optimism. And after 3 days of misery, my speech lifted the room. And Helen Clark, who was the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, was then the head of the United Nations Development Programme, today, of course, globally famous for being the lead investigator into the causes of COVID. She said, "Vic, you've got to turn that into a book. I will endorse your book." And well, the book led to sort of global speaking from Madrid to Phoenix and in between. And then in August of last year, I won't use the language, there was an Australian who challenged me and said, "What the bloody hell, why can't Victor Perton do something?" And that was the start of the Centre for Optimism. So we really opened the doors. We're only 11 months old, Brad, and yet we've got 3,500 members in 62 countries. We signed up our first Bulgarian on Sunday. And yeah, we're thriving. I mean, you know, we will go on. There's some pretty audacious views on how many people we can affect. But that's where it came from. It came from a conclusion that the leadership is actually pretty good. but we're caught up in a fog of pessimism. And I think that's true of the Western world. If you have a look, the US, Europe, most of the developed world is caught up in a fog of pessimism. Part of it is our news media, which has redefined its role from reporting the news to reporting only bad news. So if you listen to the radio or you watch the 6 o'clock news, you think the world was falling apart. But there's also deeper cultural stuff. So if you look at American television humor, it's becoming ever more nasty. It's becoming ever more negative. It's lost that sort of sparkling, radiant happiness. When you see it, you know it, and you love it. So that's where I came from, really. I'm hoping, and if you see behind me, you know, we use the beacon, the lighthouse, as our symbol. In some sense is very similar to Christianity in that sense. You know, and we call on people to be a beacon in the fog of pessimism. And when I give my speeches, I try and keep them short. But I always say to people, there's only 2 sentences I want you to remember in my speeches. The first one is that the leader looks like the person in your mirror. And I say, you ladies that use red lipstick, I want you to graffiti your work mirror with that when you get back into the office. The leader looks like the person in my mirror. And you men, if you don't use red lipstick, borrow it from a friend to graffiti a mirror. And then the second thing I say is that question, what makes you optimistic? Because the question doesn't call on you to make a decision between optimism and pessimism and not knowing. It's what are the things that make you optimistic? And as we've talked about, you know, it's faith or it's life experience. And, you know, one of the interesting scientific findings is you actually don't reach peak optimism in most people till you're actually in your 60s, when you can actually understand all those ordinary anxieties of life are just passing phases. And, if we go back to Christianity and faith, the origins of some of this stuff is very, very ancient. But one of my favorites is the English mystic, Mother Julian of Norwich. Her book is the oldest surviving book by a woman in English. I think God must have decided that. And her famous phrase is, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. And she lived through the Black Death. She lived through incredible periods of persecution because, of course, people thought the Black Death was the bounty of sin or, you know, it was of deviant religion. And so I love that phrase. And funny enough, last week on our website, the most popular page was, in fact, the one on Mother Julian of Norwich.
That is pretty amazing story too, and journey that you've done in such a short time.
Well, it's 3 generations. It's like all of these things, you know. I look back, my grandfather was tortured to death by the Soviets. My grandmother was sent to the Gulag for 12 years, but lived to outlive communism in the Soviet Union and to take part in the dissident movements. And my other grandparents were refugees, surviving, you know, 2 near-death experiences from the Soviets. So if I look at that generation, 2 generations back, you know, what they got through, or in my grandfather's case, he didn't get through, but, you know, they got through with optimism. And then, you know, my mother died a few weeks ago at the age of 92, and a refugee twice, widowed when I was young, and through to the age of 92, she kept teaching and constantly optimistic, and right to her deathbed, you know, leading with optimism. So I'm fortunate, you know, my life story is relatively brief, but when I look back 2 generations and 3 generations back, I've got the evidence of some genetics and some conditioning and lots of mindset decisions.
Yeah, and that's so important. You know, the mindset part of that is you can look at things negative or positive, you know, and it just works so much better to look at it positive.
Yeah.
I always said, parting of the Red Sea, what would you have done if Moses said, oh, I'm old and I need a cane to walk, and, let's just go back.
Yeah. And by the way, that can't happen, that space in the middle there.
Yep. And I could relate to everything you talked about except for politics, because politics in the U.S. is so straightforward.
It's not really. You meet most of them. I met Trump once. And when I met him, he was deeply courteous and curious. And I always think of him, there's this sort of personal, you can't become president of the US unless there's a lot of people who like you. And obviously people have got to donate money to campaigns, they've got to donate time. So in his case, I think there's this sort of personal style, and then, coming maybe out of The Apprentice and the like, this very aggressive style that people don't like. I don't like it. And I actually did a joke tweet the other day because I was rereading Norman Vincent Peale for two reasons. One is, of course, people had written a lot of articles about his influence on Trump, or people had written articles about Trump's misinterpretation of him. And funnily enough, amongst my mother's book collection is the original 1952 edition. So she'd obviously read it in her times of crisis and being widowed and the like. But there's this lovely comment by Norman Vincent Peale that says, don't argue. Unless someone is saying something negative and you can respond to it with a correction that is positive or optimistic. And I did a tweet and I said, I think that's the sermon that Donald Trump slept through.
That is correct. So, yeah.
Because if he actually spent less, funny enough, I think the last American president that was good at reaching across the aisle was George W. Bush. And his No Child Left Behind, which was, I think, co-sponsored by Teddy Kennedy. I think the Bushes had that, deep knowledge that allowed them to reach across the aisle. But I think Obama wasn't particularly good at it. Biden, on the other hand, is a master of it. And then, of course, Trump has never really tried to reach across the aisle. But I think most American old-fashioned politicians know how to have a cup of coffee or a beer or a glass of wine with the other side and thrash out a deal. Well, what about the ones around you, the guys that represent you?
Oh, they're actually pretty good people, and that's how it kind of works in America. You always like your local politicians, and then the federal is where you complain about them. So, and you complain.
I think it's true. I think when I was a politician, people used to say, "Oh, look, I like you, Mr. Perton, but I hate your leader." It's that sort of. The reality is, politicians tend to be like their communities. In fact, they tend to be more affable. There's no person that can go by without a handshake or a smile. They need a good politician has to have all of the tools of the salesman or woman, but on steroids. I door knocked 40,000 houses. I think probably more than the average Mormon missionary. And, you never knew what was right. You did have a brief that said, what contacts had been had with that household, but you never quite knew. And some of them were mysteries. And one of my favorites, I must share with you, Brad, was it was my first campaign. And, I was fresh-faced and 27. And I was wearing a pinstripe suit and a rosette with Liberal on it. And I got to this house with sort of torn fly wire on the front and peeling paint and long grass on the lawn. And I'm thinking, oh God, is this going to be one of my voters? And I got to the door and the door was ajar. And so I sort of knock, 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 no sound. And I stuck my pamphlet under the door, and then all of a sudden I heard this growl behind me. And it wasn't a growl at knee level, it was a growl at chest level. And I looked around and there was the biggest Rottweiler I had ever seen in my life between me and the gate. And
Oh,
I'm
no.
looking at this Rottweiler, the Rottweiler's looking at me, and then I heard behind me this, "Who the F is out there?" And this giant of a man, you know, in overalls but no t-shirt, looking out, and I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, well, I better tell the truth. And I said, "Hi, I'm Victor Perton, your Liberal candidate for Parliament." And he said, "Oh, bloody beauty, you're the man for me." And the Rottweiler burst into a smile, and I left with dog hair and a glass of beer rather than having been mauled to death. So I always loved the door knocking, and I think most politicians who are worth anything just love that contact with people. Now, of course, the difference between America and Australia, of course, is Liberal here is right of centre business party. I've never worked out how the Americans have turned Liberal into socialist or socialist into Liberal. Because, of course, in normal English around the world, Liberals tend to be for freedom and free enterprise. Only in America are Liberals socialists.
Yeah, and that's what I know, you know, a third party here, the Libertarian Party. A lot of people that don't know politics, they get that confused at first. They don't understand that they're more conservative than the Republicans in many ways.
Oh, no, they're more radical. Remember, the other thing that puzzles me about America is it's the only country in the world that has a budget that's completely out of control. I mean, your federal deficit just doesn't matter what colour the government is. I don't think you've had a balanced budget since the deal for America between Clinton and Gingrich.
Maybe even, well, truly before that even. So,
well, I think they balanced the budget. Clinton and Gingrich did a balanced budget.
Yeah, that is true. And then the deficit is what I was thinking. So, but the budget, yes. But yeah, nowadays they don't care about the budget at all. It doesn't matter. We just make more money.
They're printing it. No wonder the stock market reached 30,000.
Right.
And interest rates are zero, nothing else to invest in.
So that's hopefully that changes someday here, where we start to scale back and try to balance and live within the means of the government. So
I think it'll take a long time. I think Australia had a balanced budget in 2000. In fact, we'd reached zero net national government debt in 2006. And in fact, they set money aside. But now, of course, with COVID, we'll be paying it back for the next 30 or 40 years, I think.
So yeah, that changed some things, and I can see, you know, the stimulus money at times there, you know, where it's just necessarily to kind of prop up the economy for a little bit until it got back going. So.
Exactly. So tell me, what does 2021 hold for you, Brad? As we heading into December, Advent, then Christmas, then New Year, when you look at your best self in 2021, Brad, what does it look like?
Boy, I think it's going to be terrific. You know, we have new ways of doing things. We're refocused, I think, on better priorities. Like I talked earlier, on people rather than maybe the bottom line all the time. On building companies that really care about everybody from, say, the janitor up to the CEO. And really, I think it changed and showed different ways we can do things instead of the ways we were doing them. So I think 2021 is going to be a great year. I know a lot of people now are willing to accept, you know, come alongside me and help me, and let's move this along and get it going, and taking the steps needed to really move ahead. So.
And coaching wise, what's going to change for you in your coaching?
Well, I do a lot of virtual now, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because like you mentioned, you know, spending all that time on the airplane, where you can, in that same time, you might be able to talk to 5-10 people And when you're a CEO, like a lot of people I deal with, they are very busy. So instead of taking a half hour to drive to the office, meeting and a half hour back, they can meet and talk for a half hour and then have an extra hour to do all their other items that they, have to do in the day. So I think in a way, I don't want to say the pandemic was a good thing, but I think a lot of good came out of it. A lot of more efficient ways of doing things, possibly.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think it sounds like it's a good year for you and all around you, your customers, your workers, your family, your stakeholders. Um, and I hope there's a big emphasis on optimism. It's there's this fog of pessimism needs to be broken.
And I think it is. And I think, there's some hurdles we have in America to get over, the COVID thing. But I think even the political fighting and all that, I think people are realizing it can't go on, and they're starting to come together already. And I think that's just going to continue in 2021.
Yeah.
So, and then you'll come out with more stuff that we all can see, and that'll even help more.
Well, that's very true. One of the things I find really interesting is the role of optimism in leadership. I think that's being recognized again. It was certainly a part of American leadership in the 50s. And then, of course, you've had all these business books, which have 70, 80, 90 qualities of the leader and, different emphases. But, Dominic Barton, who was the head of McKinsey, said to me, every great leader he's ever met is infectiously optimistic, able to unlock, not the rah-rah speech from the front, it's the unlocking the optimism right across the organization. And Bob Iger from Disney in his autobiography this year, 10 qualities of the leader, but the top one was infectious optimism. And Korn Ferry, the recruitment firm, one of their 3 qualities of the leader is infectious optimism. And Templeton Foundation just published a new study in this area. So I think, obviously, people who work with you understand that need for infectious optimism. And so are you seeing, more leaders in business being explicitly optimistic and understanding how to unlock that optimism?
I do. And I think that's part of being an entrepreneur, where you, with this, pivoting or doing whatever you need to do, or you get knocked down a little bit, that didn't work, let's try this and just keep moving forward. I think you almost have to be have optimism and a good sense of humor to want to run your own business and just keep moving forward all the time. That's one thing that keeps you going, because it doesn't always go perfect, but it doesn't mean you have to look at it negatively either. You can have a positive outlook even when things might not be going exactly the way you originally planned. So.
And the other one we've done a lot of research on is in the strategy space. So we did a survey earlier this year with 400 strategy professionals from 22 countries. And 90% of them say that strategy development must be an optimistic exercise. Now, interesting enough, only 60% of them had been involved in what they would call an optimistic strategy process. It gets hijacked by consultants or futurists who paint a negative or dystopian future rather than an optimistic future. But I think the telling thing, Brad, was that only 20% of their companies measured optimism in the staff, in the customers, in the stakeholders. So what are you seeing, in the people you coach? Are people measuring optimism? Are they making sure their strategies are explicitly optimistic?
Well, and that's part of my job, is to make sure they do. So when I bring somebody in or they come to me, that's one of the first things we do is, where are you at right now? And then I make sure, getting back to what we talked about earlier with the mindset and everything else, you have to have that positive, optimistic mindset in order to, especially a lot of times when people come to me, they're not in a good spot. That's why they're coming to me. So helping them change their mindset into a positive mindset to get through what they're getting through and to move on and take the steps upward. That's a big part of what I do. And so I would say that's my job. And yes, they do. Nobody wants to be miserable. It's just they slowly let it happen and don't realize it's happening. So it's my job to make them realize what's happening and then get them back to a positive area where they can think about things in a positive way and see the light at the end of the tunnel and start taking the steps forward. And a lot of times people get stuck when they get in that negative mindset, and it's, you start being more positive, moving forward and continue to move forward. It's a good thing, and it's easier to stay positive that way.
And innovation, of course, you know, I think everyone's just sick to death. They're going to have to invent a new word. You know, just everyone's sick of being told they have to be more innovative, or they're not innovative enough, or, you know, it's in the job specs, are you an innovator? The science says you can't be an innovator unless you're an optimist. You know, the pessimist is ground down with who was at fault, why did it go wrong? Whereas you think of the great examples of innovation, Dyson and his vacuum cleaner. I think he says he had 5,000 iterations of the vacuum cleaner before he had instant success. Or Edison, I think, who had 1,000 pieces of intellectual property, but 2 of them were the only 2 that were commercially viable. And, you know, we think of Branson, you know, and businesses that have gone right, businesses that have gone wrong, but he always surfaces with a smile and the next iteration. So do you think enough of your customers and clients get the fact that innovation relies on optimism and constant experiment and, you know, the willingness to give it a go, fail, and get up and do it again?
I think so, and I think you need that, because if you really think about it, if everything's going smooth in your life, how much are you really learning? So when you have the mistakes, take the learning experience right out of that and grow from that. And that's why maybe Richard Branson is smiling, because he's learned along the way, this will happen, that'll happen, but it'll be okay, and we'll move forward from there. And I think you need to have that attitude from innovation, because there is no way to win 100% of the time, or if there is, I would like to know that. But I also can tell you, I went to a lot of schooling, but I've learned more from my mistakes than I have from all my schooling. So.
And what about the health side? I mean, you and I are of an age where, you know, optimism wasn't taught at school. And, you know, you've had last year Harvard, the American military, Boston University, you know, the trait that most indicates a healthy longevity, you know, living to 85 with your marbles and your health. The trait, it's not genetics or geography or wealth, it's optimism. And Mount Sinai Medical System, you know, the indicator that you will not suffer a heart attack is optimism. The indicator that you'll recover from a heart attack is optimism. And even just a few weeks ago, Vienna Medical School in Austria, you know, the optimist sleeps better, and sleeping better makes you more optimistic. So it's this virtuous circle. And Harvard is so strong on this that they've now said it's a public health issue, that the level of pessimism in society is so serious. And in Australia, which is such a good country to live in and so peaceful, 25% of people are on some medication for anxiety or depression. It's just weird. So, you know, do you see around you the public health officials and the like actually getting the message that Harvard is now putting out? And funny enough, Norman Vincent Peale in one of his books refers to this as a public health issue back in 1952. But do you think enough people get the fact that we want our public officials to be lifting people rather than engaging in these horrible arguments between each other?
Right. Now, I don't know. I don't know if everybody will ever totally get it, but I think there's a pretty strong movement right now where a majority of people are catching on and knowing how important it is. I mean, if you look at Harvard or Forbes or any of them, they're all talking about it. And it is so important. I mean, getting back to what we talked about earlier with gratitude in the morning, and another thing I do is pray at night before I go to sleep. And it just makes everything, and I've had some health issues I've dealt with, but it makes it all where you can stay optimistic and you can stay positive. And I think that's starting to transfer now to people with their personal lives, their business lives, because it is, not to promote my book, but it's all encompassed, where if you do have that outlook, and the optimism, your entire life is going to be better than always being a pessimist and negative and stuck in the mud and that kind of thing. So
Fantastic. Well, we've nearly gone the hour, so I think
know.
we could probably talk all day. So look, just perhaps ending up with, you've talked about gratitude, you've talked about the role of prayer, we've talked about Norman Vincent Peale, meditation, quiet. We're about to produce a new global product called The Habits of the Optimist. And we remind people to smile, to laugh, to greet like an optimist, to write like an optimist, to use affirmations. So for my audience and for your audience, you've written, the brilliant book, you're leading so many people through coaching, you're in your church community, you're helping to foster, a mindset of positivity and the like. So what would you leave people? Every day, keep a gratitude journal, make sure you read it in the morning, pray on a daily basis. What are the other lessons you'd advocate to the business person and everyone on staying optimistic and making it into a superpower and a strength?
Well, I would say it definitely is. And one thing we haven't really touched on, but it would be something, is forgiveness and forgiving people, because when you don't forgive, it weighs you down. I don't care how mad you are at that person. It's going to be harder on you than it is on them. They could care less. They're not even thinking about you. So I always tell people, the one thing, if you can't forgive, go back to praying for them, because it's pretty hard to pray for somebody and be mad at them at the same time. So, but the forgiveness part, and the other part I would say, and I think you mentioned it earlier, is self-reflection and kind of laughing at yourself and just realizing sometimes everything isn't perfect with us or the way we think, and trying to be open to other people and being optimistic about other ways of thinking, other ways of doing things. And it just makes life so much easier. And then one other thing, if I could, just if you could tell everybody, so I can share how to become a member of your organization too.
Of course. No, we welcome them. And we want to surround everyone with optimism. So, so the Centre for Optimism, easy to join. So the only trick for your people is that centre is spelt in the English way. So you've got a Centre for so if people Google just Centre for Optimism, it'll probably pick it up with CENTER as well. So if they Google Centre for Optimism, there's a free subscription. There's lots of materials for Christians, for Muslims, for Jews, for non-believers. It's now the biggest website in the world for the tools and the learning on optimism. And it's been a passion of us. And my strategy, Brad, is to go another 30 years doing this. So we will continue to build and foster, and we welcome everyone to participate. I think you and I should regularly come on and perhaps bring a couple of your coaching subjects on to talk about optimism and their stories of hope and optimism as well. I think that would be a great idea, because I think this is a partnership made in heaven, Brad. The other day I was in Bunnings, which is our biggest hardware chain, And there was a bloke there who looked at me, and we were all wearing masks. And he said, Victor. And I said, yeah. He said, Peter. He said, you won't believe this. I dreamt about you last night. I talked to my wife this morning that I got to catch up. I'm starting a new business. We need to get together. So one of our board members is John Hagel from the Deloitte Centre for the Edge. And John wrote the book, The Power of Pull. And what's marvelous in that, there's a whole chapter on serendipity, Brad. And of course, the essence of serendipity is being in the right place with the right people. Serendipity happens best when you're in the right place and in the right space and in the right mood. So, Brad Berg, this has been awesome. I have enjoyed myself immensely and really look forward to ongoing conversations with you and learning so much from your faith-based leadership.
Well, and you also, you have an incredible background, so I appreciate you taking time and us doing this. This would be great to do again in the future.
Lovely.